vindas na nossa língua portuguesa, e é com muito gosto que hoje temos uma sessão incorporada numa das nossas atividades do Centro de Estudos Clássicos e Humanísticos, mais concretamente num projeto, o Projeto BioRom, de que depois os meus colegas responsáveis também darão nota. A minha intervenção é como coordenadora do Centro de Estudos Clássicos e Humanísticos. E agora vou passar ao inglês para que a nossa convidada se sinta confortável. Peço desculpas por alguns erros de sintaxe que possam ocorrer na minha expressão inglesa, que não é a minha língua materna. So, we all welcome Louise Revel to our Center for Classics and Humanistic Studies. It's an honor to have you today here, speaking on a topic so interesting for us, that we live in what was the Spain from the Romans, so it's a pleasure. And I would like also to say that we are here in our room at the Center of Classical Studies in Coimbra with students from the PhD in Classics and also the Master degree in Classics. And now I will present, for those who don't know so well, Professor Louise. Professor Louise is an associate professor in history at the University of Southampton, Roman archaeologist, and an expert on local identities during the Roman Empire. She completed her PhD in 2000 at the University of Southampton, entitled Exploring Roman Identities, Case Studies from Spain and Britain in the 2nd century Anno Domini. Dr. Louise is interested in the impact of Rome on the provincial communities of the Western Empire, but she also explores questions of social identity within the Roman provinces, including ethnicity, age, and gender. She also holds a Getty Fellowship as part of the Arts of Rome's Provinces workshop. Dr. Louise is author of several publications on Roman identities, just to name a few. In 2015, she published a monograph entitled Ways of Being Roman, Discourses of Identity in the Roman West. In the following year, she co-edited the Oxford Handbook of Roman Britain, and in 2018, the monograph Roman Imperialism on the Local Identities was published by Cambridge University Press. So it's a pleasure and an honor, and I give you the word, Louise.
Thank you. It's a pleasure and an honor for me to have been invited and to come here to talk to you today. It's my first visit to Coimbra, not to Portugal, but to Coimbra. So it's very exciting after 2 years of not being able to travel to be able to come to such a lovely city and share my research with you. I'm aware that a lot of you are PhD students and master students, that you may not be archaeologists. So what I hope to do is I'm going to talk a bit about my work, but what I want to do is to present to you a case study which I'm currently investigating, and to think about how I approach the material, in the hope that if you don't deal with Roman, if you don't deal with archaeology, if you don't deal with legal charters, you'll then find something in it that you can take and apply, or you may find something that you can then take and apply to your own research, as you may be thinking about identity and social questions in the classical world. Because my work on identity has used it as a way to investigate the social history of Rome's Western provinces. From ethnic identities to family relationships, my interest is in the people of the Western provinces and how they made sense of how they fitted into their wider societies. In my case as well, how they fitted into this great imperial structure that we call the Roman Empire. I've tried to go go beyond some of the binary polarities which we tend to find within this, the Roman, non-Roman, accepting, resistant, those change resistance paradigms. I've also tried to think about how Roman imperialism doesn't just might not just make people feel part of a Roman Empire, but what the impacts might be or might not be on other aspects of their identity. So the idea that ethnicity doesn't sit apart from things like their gender, their age, their rank, but how the spread of Roman culture might or might not have had an impact on, for example, family structures or gender. And I would argue that this then actually feeds back. It isn't a secondary question, it actually feeds back into our understanding of Roman imperialism, because if, for example, you find that family structures are not, or at least are not changing, seemingly, in the province of Baetica, probably one of the most Roman-like provinces in the West. But in terms of family relationships, we don't see that. Then what does this tell us about imperialism? And in a way, what Rome wanted or expected out of its empire or its provinces. So this is how I've used identity and how I use identity to think about bigger questions such as imperialism, but also important questions like family, age, and those kinds of things. Now, I want to start by talking a little about identity itself. We tend to talk about identity in very vague terms, and there has been recently something of a negative reaction to the term, based on the idea, I think, modern ideas of identity, and in particular, the priority of the individual. Sometimes it's talked about as though identity is self-evident, and it is not a problematic term. At other times, there are accusations that it's a modern term, that we can't find it in the past, that we are indulging in a form of, I suppose you could say, psychological investigation. What did people think about themselves? And I'm going to sort of counter some of these. But to start with, as I said, identity has been used in a multitude of ways. So I want to start with how I think of identity. There are alternative ways of thinking about it, but I would say that fundamentally, our identity is our sense of who we are, but also which groups we feel we share an affinity with. It's unstable. You don't acquire an identity and then sit with it for the rest of your life. It's constantly under negotiation, where you fit into that society, but also how those sort of social structures like rank, like gender, might change over time, how they might change in response to certain external forces. That any person has multiple aspects, and somehow you have to try and reconcile those. You may, as I very often do, be looking at a single aspect, but you need to be aware of what that intersection might be. That certain aspects will be dominant depending on the context. Arguably, one of the reasons my thesis looked at the 2nd century AD was because I did not want to do the transition. That I wanted to look at Roman identity at the point where it was almost taken for granted, where it was less contested than it might be in the first decade, where people were born into a Roman world, not where they were born into a different world and becoming Roman. You could say I took the easy route, but unless we understand what it was that enabled them to identify with a Roman world, we're never going to understand the change, was my argument. And also that a person's identity, as said, changes over time. It changes over the course of their life. And I think this is one quite interesting thing, the impact of a lived life. Obviously, ideas of you change identity as you go through your life, from child to teenager, 20th century construct, to to adult. I don't know about in Portugal, but in Britain, we now have a new age identity, the 3rd age, as it's called, where people have retired, so they're kind of 65, but they're still healthy, they're still active, and they have a lot of money. And so we have this new identity, and now elderly is what happens when you hit about 70 or 80, and you become and your health starts to fail and you can no longer go on cruises. I would say cruises are the defining point. But that's my stereotype as not having got there yet. So that's my approach to identity, the kinds of things that I think about, the kind of assumptions that underpin what I do. I suppose in terms of, my slides seem to have doubled. In terms of how we approach identity, so if those are my assumptions, what do I do when I'm thinking about what I'm looking for? How do I investigate it? Well, I start out by thinking I'm not looking for an individual's identity. I'm not looking to identify a hypothetical person in the past and say, this is how they thought of themselves. A pragmatic reason, a sort of self-evident reason, is because we can never answer that question, or at least not for the provinces. But a more, I suppose, a more fundamental question is that anybody makes sense of who they are from the wider social, what we call social structures, so the ideas, the practices, the beliefs that are shared by either that society or the group that they share an affinity with. And part of that will be how the group thought of themselves, but also another part of it is how they were thought of by people outside of that group. Obviously, within this, we have very much power relationships. So I don't look for an individual. I might occasionally use it as a research device, as a way of thinking. I have my unnamed person. These are my bigger structures. What did they do which might have led to them sharing an affinity with a group or feeling that they belong to a certain group? And so sometimes I can use that as a sort of method of thinking, how do the disparate elements link together? How does, as I shall talk about, how does voting link with taking part in a sacrifice, linking with going to watch a gladiatorial show in terms of how you create? And so therefore use that kind of personal biography. But I would never claim that is any single person's experience. I would just say that is a way in which you could, or enables us to draw these things together. So that's the first sort of method, sort of assumption that underpins the way I do it. The second is that although I very often am dealing with archaeological materials or various kinds of materials which can be labelled, and you can look and you can say, okay, that is Roman. In Britain, our equivalent is we have Samian ware, terra sigillata, red glossy ware. Mm-hmm. We find that when we excavate a site, it's Roman. That's a lot of weight to put on a potsherd. But also, possessing that did not necessarily mean that was how the person thought of themselves, or that was how the society viewed that. And I think we can think of modern or early modern parallels when, for example, the West engaged with, for example, China or Egypt, and things came in as being exotic. And the minute they were labelled exotic, they took on a different meaning and were used in different ways to how they may have been used in the place they originated. Mm-hmm. But instead, rather than labelling the materials and looking for the materials, what I do is I look at the way in which they are used, the practices which surround them. And so this is based on, I suppose, in all the literature on identity. One of the common themes comes through from the idea of it is what we do as we live in the world, as we carry out social practices. We are creating who we are. My favourite, or at least an example I very often use, is that of a teaching space. The fact that I am sitting here talking to you, this is creating my authority. The way this table is laid out is creating the authority of those of us at this end. Those kinds of things. It's in those practices that we actually start to create, or we internalize our identities. It's very interesting as part of this to then walk around a lecture theatre, around the back of the students. They sort of, no, cannot do this.
Aguardar uma hora.
Okay, that's fine. And then finally, I suppose my approach, which it's difficult to sort of put in because we always use sort of taxonomic or classification terms as a shorthand. But I think one of the things is embracing the idea of variability. So one of the things, variability, not taxonomy, is that this has come out of particularly Judith Butler's work, thinking about sort of gender theory, queer theory, but rejecting classification systems where you have the dominant or the what's expected as being the normal, and then you have variations, and so you divide it. And I think one of the reasons it appeals to me is it so mirrors the division between Roman, not Roman. And you start off with that taxonomy. You're either Roman or you're not Roman in provinces. Or you're somewhere in between that we can't quite describe, we don't know where to put you. Or you have a bit of both. But hybrid is works for biology. I'm not sure it works for social, because how do you think of yourself as being split between two different things unless it's in a very specific circumstance? Potentially like that initial transitionary period, but not necessarily a couple of generations later. And so it's taking from this gender theory the idea that there is variability within any one of these labels, and that is why the taxonomy breaks down. So if you talk about woman, which is where I suppose the sort of first contention came from, it's a meaningless term. There are so many different experiences that intersect with other aspects of identity, but also may just be a local creation, a local understanding of the term, that although you might use it as a term, and obviously we do use it as a term, but to talk about a single experience or a single identity of being woman is, it gets you nowhere, well, arguably. And therefore, that's one of the things that I suppose I confronted very early on. What do you describe as Roman? And so, again, I took an approach when I was doing my PhD, and I have sort of continued with that anybody who lives in the Roman Empire is at some level Roman. They may be in a case of complete resistance to that term, in which case that is telling us something. The way in which they resist. It's not that they carry on the sort of, I suppose you can say, the event that has the potential to disrupt the society has occurred. And therefore, what is their experience of living within this empire? So those are the approaches. I'm now going to go on, close it. And so these are the approaches that have underpinned the work that I do, both in terms of my assumption of what identity is, but also in terms of the way in which I go about my research. So what I'm going to do now is actually give you a case study, which I've been working on. I've presented at a couple of conferences, but it's something I want to expand out because I'm finding it very interesting. And in this sense, it's to do with one of the things which has been talked about, which is the subaltern or the non-elite experience of what it is to be Roman. Because one of the, certainly from the perspective of studying Roman Britain, one of the, I suppose you could say, one of the charges that gets thrown against a lot of the work is that it's focusing solely on the elite. And so almost picking up a picture of a Romanized or Roman sympathizing elite who are nice urban magistrates in some provinces joining equestrian senatorial orders, less so in Britain, but that underlying that is a society that remains unchanged. And one of the interesting things to me, or which I have been working on, is actually what this non-elite experience might be. Thinking about the strands which are involved in it, how working practices might change, for example, economic practices, as you, given the extent of the scale of the economy, it has an impact on, for example, the ceramic industries, where you get increased specialization. What does that do? The mining industry in Iberia, for example, which goes on to a huge industrial scale. What does that do to how work changes as a way of forming people identity. But here I want to think about local citizenship, partly because I do tend to specialise in urbanism and towns and the architecture of towns as well as the epigraphy. But also, I think because that's one thing we can start to identify what some of these experiences might be. There's been a lot of focus on citizenship within Republican Rome, for example. I'm thinking particularly of Nicolet's book, The World of the Citizen in Republican Rome. But there's also been a lot of recent work done on things like voting and those kinds of elements. There's also been work done on ideas of citizenship and changing ideas of citizenship in the Greek East, the eastern provinces. But there's been a lot of fantastic work done on, I suppose you can say, urban legal aspects and also on the magistrates and benefaction. There's been a huge amount of fantastic work done on that. But somewhere in there, your standard, ordinary urban citizen has been slightly overlooked. Now, I'm going to start with a sort of definition. I'm going to talk about citizens and citizenship, but when I talk about citizens and citizenship, I'm not talking about Roman citizens and citizenship. What I'm talking about are the local citizens. So, because I will inevitably forget to say local urban citizens, and I will just talk about citizens, please insert that on my behalf. So all the time I'm talking about the local towns, the small Roman towns, some smaller, some bigger, which have their own citizen body, some of whom will be Roman citizens, particularly the elite and the magistrates, but some of whom won't be. What I'm reconstructing is what it's like to be a citizen of one of these towns. So how do we do? What is the life of the citizen like? What kind of evidence can we use? Ultimately, a lot of this is coming back to the legal charters. And one of the reasons why I'm starting this investigation, and so far it's been focusing on Iberia is the best place to look at for the legal charters in the Western provinces, thanks to the multiple forms of the municipal charter, the Lex Ienitana, the Lex Alapensa, the Lex Malicitana, one of which, and I'm not sure which, is shown there. And also there is the colonial charter, the Lex Ursinensis, Colonia Iulia Relativa. We have these charters. Now, these have been looked at and pored over and extensively written about by legal, and I suppose you can say quasi-legal perspectives. So people looking to see what does it say about the law on? What does it say about how you set up religion in a town? All those kinds of things. But if you look carefully, you can get a different perspective on this. You can ask a different question. And that is, what do these charters tell us about what your average, your normal citizen did? How did they engage with the town? There's a couple of other forms of evidence we can add on to this, the surveyor's reports, and there's other forms of legal evidence. But the charter is the main thing, and that's where I'm at the moment. I've gone through these in great depth. And I would argue that you can, if we're thinking about performing citizenship, that citizenship is something that you do. You both are a citizen in a legal sense, but you also do citizenship. You have various things that you can do as a citizen, or you are required to do as a citizen. So this is what I'm encompassing in performing citizenship. And I would say you can put them into three different categories: political, legal, religion, and economic. As in all things, there's a lot of fuzziness and overlap and grey areas between them, but it's sort of starts to summarise what these are. So I'm not going to go through the whole thing, the sort of whole detail of this, but I just want to give you a flavour. What are your political responsibilities as a citizen? What are the political actions, activities that make you a citizen? The first of these is elections, and in some ways this is the one I've done most work on, the kind of idea of going to vote on an annual basis for who are going to be your magistrates for the next year. And this is most clearly outlined in the municipal law in the surviving section of the Lex Malicitana. The person who holds an election, i.e. one of the magistrates, one of the elite for that year, is to summon the citizens, the townspeople, the municipes, by curia, by group, to cast their vote in such a way that he summons all the curiae to the vote with one summons, and that each casts their vote in its ballots in separate enclosures. You used to see a presence beside the ballot box of some adjudicators who will make sure they swear in good faith. Very legalistic, very dry. What does that mean? Well, actually, that means that if you want to take part, if you're a citizen of the town, there is an expectation, or you have the right to, on an annual basis, wherever you live, go into the town, presumably the forum, though it never says, to be allocated into a curia, to literally pass through those voting gates and to cast your ballot. What form does it take? Is it like, is it dropping a coloured ball into a box or what? We don't know. But anyway, you go and you vote, surrounded by your fellow citizens. And then there's a whole series of detail about how various people swear oaths in the name of the emperors that they will see it happens correctly. You might hang around to see who's going to be elected to the magistracies for the next year. So here, citizenship has both a legal aspect that we can look at, but underneath that legal aspect, we can see some of what might be the performative element of it. There are other aspects which I won't go into in great depth, otherwise I'll be here all day, but things like accountability. You have the right to challenge decisions of the magistrates, for example. So holding them to account. Did this ever happen? We don't know. We can't say that, but you at least have the right. That informs what citizenship is. That you are expected to be an informed citizen, an engaged citizen. And this is where it comes to all these sort of ideas that within the legal charters, or at least the requirements of the amount of things that have to be written up and publicly displayed. There is an assumption that these are going to be read because it is stipulated in certain of these passages that there is a requirement it can be read from ground level. So there's an idea that the names of the candidates will be written up. There is an idea that the edicts of the town council will be written up. Again, this is the kind of thing that's difficult to get a grasp on what it looked like. Is it like Pompeii, where you have the walls of the town covered in graffiti? Or is it more that you have a whole load of these bronze plaques, which I don't know about you, but I find very difficult to read? Does it matter whether the people could read them or not? Or is it more about knowing that you have a right to be told what's going on? That politics isn't something that is done to you and you're never consulted, that you are told this. Oh, that's the latest thing that the council passed. Nudge neighbour who you know can read a bit better. Can you tell me what it says? That kind of thing. So information. And then finally, one thing that I'd never really realised until I read these in more detail, it is stipulated in the colonial charter that the attendants for the magistrates, all these soothsayers and scribes and flute players and attendants and the lictors and passes holders and whatever else that they were surrounded by. It's actually stipulated they have to be members of the colony, the colonia. They have to be colonists. So you can actually get involved in that aspect of it. Okay, not the most glamorous, trailing round, following your magistrate on a daily basis, wondering what he's doing. But it's still part of that creation of what it is to be a citizen. Okay. That's an idea of the political. As I said, I'm afraid it's just a kind of snapshot. Another aspect is the legal. So trials are held within the town, and there's an awful lot of scholarship on what that tells us about legal aspects. But actually, again, when you go into the charters, you have this idea of, in setting out a trial, how a trial should be held, there is a requirement for witnesses to actually go and attend the trial to give their evidence. And in one of the charters, and I can't remember which one, it's set out at what time of day these are going to be held, how long people can talk for. These are face-to-face, these are very much in-person trials. Similarly, if you want to register your land, whatever land you own, you go to the town and you register it within the archive. This is within the surveyor's legal sort of texts. Management of property is done through the town. There's a town proposing to put an aqueduct over your land. If you want to go and protest, you have to go to the town. And you do that as a citizen. If you want to manumit your slaves, you have to go to the town and declare that in front of a magistrate. All these kind of things, and I have to say this overlaps quite a lot with property, with the economic aspects, but all of this, again, is something that is how you perform your membership of this community and being part of this community. The other one where we get back to being able to reconstruct some nice rituals and some nice performances again is religion. And this idea that at the foundation of the colonia, it is set out that the first set of magistrates shall say what the dates and the numbers of festival days are to be, the sacrifices publicly performed, who's going to perform them. There's also text that there's also elements which say how many days of things like games, gladiatorial games, theatrical games. One of them stipulates that somebody has to give games in the forum. And so again, this is religion is another form of civic activity which brings the community together, which creates this sense of community with which you identify. One thing which isn't mentioned so much are banquets, but we have lots of epigraphic evidence to say that communal banquets were taking place, either for the whole community or for subsections within that, pointing to the fuzziness. You can be part of the community, but you can also be part of a very specific element of that community, be it a religious group or a political group or whatever. The final element is economic. And this overlaps a lot with property. This is the most ephemeral. This is the hardest one to find in the actual charters. We have the references to property, which I've already talked about in terms of administration. Taxes, interestingly, are not very much talked about, but where do people pay their taxes? Who keeps the tax records? Is that something that happens in the towns and therefore sort of creates that sense of civic identity? Corvée labour, which is something that's been overlooked, whether it's supplying your labour, your slaves' labour, and your ox's labour, your oxen labour, on 3 or 5 days of the year to the town, or whether it's the fact that you can be enrolled into a militia to defend the town. These are responsibilities that you may be called upon. Corvée labour is interesting because it's very little talked about, but it is a bit surprising. Now, cumulatively, all these aspects of the Charter, all these 4 different kinds of aspects, point towards a very specific idea of citizenship. It's one that requires an active engagement, sometimes as part of a big communal event, like the voting and the religious festivals and the games, but sometimes a more private act, something that's less public, less less public, less large scale, more mundane. Things like going and registering your ownership of the property, going and checking out on who owns water rights, that kind of thing. These are individual obligations, but they are ones that brought the individual into contact with the urban authorities and likely the physical setting of the town. And so these then all work together to reinforce this idea of the significance of the urban centre as a place where this kind of stuff is conducted, but also the importance of being a part of that community and having some kind of allegiance with that civic community. So that's how I use the legal charters. The other form of evidence, and the other reason why Southern Iberia is so good, is the other string of evidence is the epigraphic record. And I think as Corpus Inscriptum Latinorum, Volume 2, which is the Iberian volumes, is being republished, it is just amazing how many inscriptions there are, particularly from Baetica. It's particularly noteworthy if you also study Britain, which has 3,000 in total from the province. You can get that from a single conventus in Iberia. So that's why I'm starting this work from here. And I want to take a single inscription. It's also one of the most informative inscriptions I've come across, which is why I use it a lot. But when we look at an inscription like this, I haven't given you the full text, but I've given you the basic things it's commemorating. It's a statue base that's set up in the Forum in the town of Singilia Barba. You can see the Forum. I think it was positioned beside one of those two staircases. So nice prominent position, big inscription, statue on top. This thing's going to be the best part of 3 meters high. Summary of the inscription: it was dedicated on the day he ceased to be duovir, one of the leading magistrates. So it's at the end of his year of office. The citizens and the non-citizen inhabitants dedicated a bronze statue to him, presumably the statue that was on top of this base, located in a prominent place. And the whole thing says that as part of this, public thanks were given in the Forum, sacrifices were burned, and it was in thanks for the good administration of the town and his donation of games and free entry to the baths to those living in the town, citizens and incolae. Now, normally we'd approach that from the perspective of Proculinus and the duovirs. What does this tell us about the duovirs and the magistrates? What kind of acts of benefaction did they carry out for the community? What acts of munificence? What gifts did they give the community? How were they rewarded? How is this part of the whole sort of elite status? But, skip. If we take a slightly different perspective on it, we can then get a different set of activities. The dedication tells us, and I think it's 2 separate places in this dedication, that it was dedicated by the cives and the incolae, the citizens and the non-citizen inhabitants. How did they dedicate it? And that is one I'm not sure we'll ever get the answer to. Is that a fiction and it was actually the town council that voted it? Or was at an assembly, maybe the assembly that had just taken place, the contio that had just taken place to elect the next year's magistrates, was there a vote taken? Do you want to set up a statue and are you prepared to contribute to it? Because it also tells us they paid for it. Are you prepared to contribute to it? We don't know. Located in a prominent place in the Forum, this is part of their urban landscape. They know this is part of their understanding of citizenship and how the urban community works. A statue isn't just, a statue is there to be seen. It is there to be understood and read. And that's one of the things they'll be doing. And the prominent place will add to that. Public thanks were given, presumably on the day he left office. Sacrifices burned. Were these large scale? Public thanks. Was this at some kind of event when the people would be there? If it's not a formal contio, then there's some indication that you could use a market day as a day when you would conduct public business. So it could have been a market day that these public thanks were given to him and sacrifices burned. Did the bird sacrifices result in any kind of feasting? I mean, it's not said. So in thanks for his good administration of the town, his donation of games. So obviously at some point during his year in office, there was the opportunity to go and take part in games. And from Singilia Barba, it seems that some of these are going to be circus games because we've got other mentions of circus games taking part in the town. He also gave free entry to the baths. So part of being a citizen is this idea of public bathing. And there's a whole other element you can go down about attitudes to the body, but that's not so much here. But so you can see how from this, okay, you can say it's not very much, but you start to get an image of what citizenship might have involved. Some of these, again, public practices. Let's see. So it's pointing to a series of events, a series of occasions when the citizen body had the opportunity to engage with the town centre, but also to engage with this idea of them being part of this civic community, whether as a cives, in case of Singilia Barba and Munich Pace, or as an incolae, as somebody who dwells in the community. What we then The second strand of the epigraphic evidence that we can then start to see is the way in which they absorbed this and the way in which they started to see the urban community as the way in which they identified themselves. And so here is just a very standard inscription. Again, it is actually from a member of the elite, but we do have a lot of these, where somebody, Marcus Fabius Probus, defines himself as being from Augi, from the Municipium Flavium Augutani. One of the interesting things, and it's something that seems to be distinctive to Iberia, you don't see it in Italy, is this repetition, this almost accumulation of the names and the titles of the town. So he calls himself as Augutanus, Flamen Municipi Flavi Augutani. And you get ones where you just have this build-up. I think the Proculinus one may do it. You just have this build-up of mentioning, of naming the town. And it ties into an argument by Tom Dirks looking at Germania, the German provinces, arguing that you can, he was sort of taking a longitudinal look, so he was looking at how over time you see this adoption, the move away from the kind of tribal identifiers, moving into using the title of the urban community to describe yourself. And again, this is what we're seeing here, arguably. So, from the using this kind of performative reading, this reading of performance within, or activities within the legal charters, sort of taking this idea of communal participation within the epigraphic record and communal allegiance within the epigraphic record, I would argue we can start to build up a picture of the ways in which a civic community was formed, the ways in which people came to self-identify with the urban community. Nicolay has a wonderful quote, and I now have lost it. The kind of idea of civic performances, the civic routines, which created that sense of being part of a community, that build-up of, in this case, in the case of Probus, an explicitly stated identity of being Augutani, but in many cases less so. But the other thing, and this goes back to how I said I use identity, is that you can then tie it into the significance of this, because I've been talking about these kind of local identities. I haven't talked about kind of big global imperial identity. But the intersection of all of these means that at the same time as, for example, our citizen is going to vote, our citizen is going to the games, maybe going to watch a theatrical game, they are encountering other aspects which then become shared with other people within the empire and start to build up what we might think of as some kind of common Roman experience, or common experience of being a provincial in the Roman Empire. So it's that kind of building up. So a lot of these sort of performative elements are not just about creating citizenship. We've seen that there is this idea of the citizens and the incolae. Well, voting is going to be one of the occasions which separates them out. Unless you are an incola with Roman citizenship, unless you can vote, in which case you can vote. But if you're an incola who isn't a Roman citizen, you can't. If you're a woman, you can't vote, so that's immediately. If you're an adolescent, if you're a young boy, this is something Ray Lawrence has talked about, you are watching this with the expectation that in 5 years' time, that's going to be you. Once you are able to do that, you have then transitioned into being an adult. As part of being a citizen, you are now also adult, you are also a man. Your sister is never going to have that opportunity. So you can see how these kind of things, I've focused on the way in which they're forming a civic identity, but you can also take exactly the same performances and talk about how they are bringing in other aspects of identity. And so if we want to think about what makes a shared understanding of what it is to be within the Roman Empire, you will notice I'm very cagey about saying a Roman identity because of the scholarship surrounding that term, the way it gets used. If you use that term, you are arguing a very specific point of view. So this kind of shared experience is kind of how I talk about it. And if we want to think about how these same kinds of things are creating this, we can go back to, for example, ideas of the centrality of urbanism. Urbanism is one of the defining characteristics of the Roman Empire. Certainly in the Western provinces, we see the development of a specific type of urbanism, civic urbanism, where it didn't exist previously, or at least had very limited presence previously. You can say no presence if you're talking about Britain, obviously slightly less than but very limited presence previously. And this becomes a shared understanding. There's a whole kind of idea about urbanism. Certainly for the Romans, we can trace it in people like Cicero or Tacitus, talking about the equation between urbanism and their concept of civilization. Law codes, interestingly, but also correct forms of behaviours. And so it's creating this shared commonality. Similarly, we can talk about something like the bathing, creating a similar assumption about practices of the body, cleaning of the body, that cleaning the body is something you do in public, not in private. In Britain and Gaul, it goes hand in hand with the adoption of things like combs and razors for shaving off your beards, and things for cleaning your fingernails. I don't know what the Spanish term is, but in the English we call them toilet implements, things for keeping the body clean, which we only find in the very late Iron Age horizon when you're starting to get Roman materials come in. And it's arguably, when you put it in a conjunction with bathhouses and all that kind of thing, it's about a very different attitude towards how you present the body. Very Foucauldian, very much out of Foucault. But we're sort of getting hints of this, which might then be shared. So one of the things we can then see is the way in which we have all these various elements intersecting together and promoting this kind of shared experience. And I suppose in terms of knowledge, one of the most fundamental elements is the engagement with the emperor. Not the emperor in person, particularly by the 2nd century AD, you're not going to see the emperor at all. But, or most places are very rarely going to see the emperor. But you are surrounded by reminders, the coins that you use to take to market to pay for things or pay your taxes with. The oaths that the successful magistrates swear. They're swearing their oaths that they will administer the town well in the name of a sequence of emperors and deified emperors. But also in the physical fabric of the town. This is Italica, and it doesn't quite come through on the slide, but all the dots which are shown, which are in the theatre, where we think the forum is, in the 2 sets of baths, and in the what's thought to be the temple to the imperial cult. There is a whole sequence of statues of emperors. The theatre is interesting because, of course, if you go to see your Ludi Skyniki, which are being presented as part of your magistrate's year in office with all your other fellow townspeople, you are actually surrounded by statues of the emperors. You know who these people are. Well, you know they're an emperor. You know that their face looks a bit like the one on that coin that you just paid with or something like that. So it then becomes part of this, engaging in the town, in the urban centre, then becomes part of this shared knowledge of the emperor. So in this way, we start to see the linkages going between the local and the consequences of tying these local citizens into much broader empire-wide forms of knowledge and experiences, as well as at a local level. This kind of citizenship, the consequences are also to divide the communities within the overall civic community, or the groups within the overall civic community. Okay, so that's my case study. So what are the implications of the approach I've outlined here? One issue which has been a problem in terms of research into cultural change within the provinces has been the question of whether an individual thought of themselves as being Roman. It's not a question we can answer. We're hardly ever going to be able to answer that. Instead, what we're answering is the question of what are the elements which might create that common experience of being Roman. I mean, I would actually argue that by 2nd, 3rd century, it's not about being Roman. Probably by the 4th century it is again, but 2nd, 3rd century, primary allegiance may well be to this urban community, local community that you live in, and you're kind of aware that you are part of this wider Roman Empire. But as I said, ultimately we can't answer the question about how anybody thought of themselves. But what we can do is create the socio-political, the cultural institutions through which they made sense of how they fitted into their world, into their community, which groups they identified with, or might identify with. It allows us to anticipate more than one form of self-identification within a single moment. That, yes, one form may be dominant, but there will be other elements of identity still in play. It allows us to move beyond binary oppositions. You have the Incoli, who have some elements of citizenship, other elements have not. But it also allows us to frame it that there may be multiple ways of creating communities within the Roman world which shared some of these. And so the obvious sort of alternative to this is a set of experiences around military service, which obviously is, if you study Britain, becomes very marked, where some things are shared, particularly the emperor, I would argue, is probably one of the most shared ones, but also bathing. It's amazing. Bathhouses are a thing that you have in forts, and a very early thing that there seems to be priority on bathing in forts. But also, there are differences. But is one more Roman than the other? No, they're just different ways of being integrated into the community. So what it gives us, going back to this sort of approach, is how we investigate it. We can focus on things like citizenship, urban citizenship, local communities, civic communities, civic identity, communities as a way to think about civic identities without trying to identify whether this individual person thought of themselves as being a member of one community or another. We need to focus on the practices. The materials do form shorthands, and if in Britain you are then, where you don't have the charters, you're then reliant upon thinking about materials, and in terms of the materials, you then have to think about how they're being used, not just their presence or absence, it's about how they might have been used. And we need to think about variability. We're not talking about are they Roman or not Roman? Are they elite or not elite? We're thinking about the variability within these kind of experiences, within these kinds of discourses. Okay, so I hope I've given you a flavour of how I use identity, and in particular performativity, to answer the questions I'm interested in. But as I said at the beginning, as you start on your careers as researchers, I hope I've given you some things to think about, which you may or may not be able to incorporate into your own research. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have if I haven't talked for too
long. Thank you very much, Louise, for a stimulating talk. I'm sure that here in this room, and maybe those who are watching us on live in YouTube, have answers or some thoughts to share with you and ask for your opinion. Now I will leave the conduction of this second part of our lecture to my colleague, Claudia Teixeira, who is one of the responsibles for our project BioRom. So Claudia, perhaps you can. You can watch. You can see. I think you can see from here. It's better. Try to.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Louise. So we have time now for questions. Who wants to start?
Don't be shy.
I can start in order to open the discussion. I'm very concerned about the emperor, and I was thinking about the possible influence of the names. Do you have something to say about the names in Iberia, the names of cities or names of people? From the name of the emperor,
Yes.
of course.
I think cities is probably very interesting in that one of the things it's quite hard to do in the West, but is obviously influential, is important, is the way in which urban communities create their own histories. And the incorporation of the names of the emperors into the names of the cities. I mean, it's interesting that a lot of the Flavian municipalities, when they're setting up these inscriptions, actually keep Flavi. So they're kind of keeping these names. And I hadn't thought about the personal names, but yes, there must be an impact. That idea of, yes, this is a common name, it ties me into that, particularly given you've got the change in name. And I suppose it might be influential in that first generation where you see people who are given the name of the reigning emperor who may have made them citizens. So Julius, you get a whole load of Julii and that kind of thing. So yes, I suspect it does, but I'm not sure how we pick that one apart, but yes, I'm sure that naming and that shared name gives you has the potential to give an idea of, yes, we have this kind of shared element. It's not a name that we are unfamiliar with, it's a very familiar name. Yeah, interesting question. Well, thank you.
In fact, I have two questions. Not question. But when you were talking, 2 points paid my attention very intensely. One is when we look to those charters with so tiny letters and who can read it, and I was thinking, I don't know, because I don't, I'm not Romanist, and so my question is authentic. Do they have a practice of reading those charters out loud, public readings for what occasions, or no? We cannot define that idea.
Yeah, there isn't. I don't know of one. I mean, the charters are read out. I think there's somewhere in the charters the thing that if you pass a law, it is read out in a contio. But then it's then placed on the wall. But I think in some ways it may well be the symbolic significance of the laws, that there is a process, there is an idea of there being a law that people follow. That is how you organise your society, and then we put them up on this thing that you can't read. I think it's different when you think about things like the emperors and the statues to the emperors. You may not be able to read those because they're quite complex, they're quite difficult, you need high levels of literacy, and they're in bronze as well, and a form of cursive. But things like statues to emperors, imp kais, you only need to read 7 letters, which are always repeated. You know it's a statue to the emperor. You don't know which one, but it's imp kais. That's a statue to the emperor. You know it's a statue. You can guess it's a statue of Proculinus because it's got 5 letters. IIVIR. That's yours. So I think some of these can work as almost as symbols where you don't necessarily need the high literacy. With the legal charters, it could be as much, it's symbolic of the fact that we have a legal structure. This is a formal structure, and it's not that the duoviers can do what they want or the magistrates can do what they want. It's that they have to follow these. And somebody can say, you're not following these.
Okay.
At which point you may then go and find somebody and say, can you read that to me so I can know what to accuse them with?
The other aspect was about bath and body.
Yeah.
And go to the bath regularly. We have the possibility to go women at some hours, men at others, etc. But when I think on those thermae or etc., I always think of the possibility to have a convivium there because you meet people. It's not only the body that stimulates you to go, because you have also messages. You can do some sports there. So found people have new relationships, etc.
Yeah.
So it's a bigger picture than the body. Of
Yes,
course, the body
it
and
is, yes.
hygiene, it's important.
Yeah.
But what is your opinion
I
about this?
entirely agree. There's a very interesting paper by Janet Delane who contrasts the Republican baths in Italy with the ones in the Principes and the emperors, about how the Republican ones, you just have a real focus on the suites to wash in, and the baths and the sort of cleanliness aspect. And once you get to the ones from the Principate, one of the things that you see is the addition of big changing rooms, big recreation rooms, spaces which are not about cleanliness. And that seems to be something that you can see reproduced in the Western provinces. You can see the creation of these spaces for the kind of convivial aspects of bathing. And in fact, there's a very interesting shift in the military bathhouses in Britain, the ones for the auxiliary soldiers, which are non-citizen soldiers. The ones for the citizens, the legionary bathhouses are like a baths of Caracalla in the middle of a legionary fortress. They're huge, lots of facilities for sports, for meeting people, for interacting. The ones for the non-citizen soldiers, when they're first built, they just have Tapidarium, Frigidarium, Caldarium. That's it. You go and you get clean. There's not even any trace of a changing room. At some point, they then get changing rooms added and they get rebuilt. They get the additional rooms put on and this, that, and the other. And so at some point, which seems to be late 2nd, early 3rd century, there's this reconception of what bathing is within the non-citizen forces, the auxiliary forces, that actually, yes, bathing is about convivial aspects, about meeting people, about taking your time, as much as about being clean and that kind of thing.
And it's public occasion and it's for men and for women. So when we separate, but there they can go and they can do and they can find other friends, etc., etc.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, Louise.
Question?
I had a question. So, returning to the legal charters and epigraphic records, just to clarify, it was that in Iberia there was like a larger amount of them, which made it an advantageous area for your research. Is that it?
Yeah.
Okay.
So the reason behind this is there's the colonial charter, but which we have equivalents of those from Italy and that kind. But in the Flavian period, 70s, 80s, the entire, I think it's all 3 provinces were given, the urban centres were given the status of municipium. And there seems to be, at that point, they all seem to have been given a single charter. Well, not a single charter. It's a framework charter that they could then put in their local names and this, that, and the other. And so because of that, there's a huge number of chartered towns, probably more than anywhere else in the Western provinces. Well, we only have 1 municipium in Britain, for example. But also there does seem to be this element, there is something strange going on in terms of epigraphic display. But that's one of the reasons we have more of them. We have 3, which together give us a huge chunk of this kind of master charter. And then there's fragments. I can't remember how many. I think there's about 20 fragments from about 20 other places as well, which confirm this was widespread. But recently there's been a 3rd century example discovered on the Danube frontier, which has the same laws within it. The phrasing is different, but the laws are the same. But it's only a couple of fragments and nobody's seen it properly because it's in the antiquities black market. So, but it does seem that this, and so therefore you can kind of take this and say, yes, this is likely to be applicable more widely.
Thank you.
Questions? No higher.
There.
Okay.
I had this question about the Iberian region. I believe it's a region famous because of the rebellions and the sedition population we had, at least when it was conquered. I don't know how it was in the imperial age, but my question arises from that. And I was wondering if the people there, the Iberian, different Iberian peoples, if there's any evidence or record about them maintaining their previous identity before the Roman times, or accounts of revolutions or seditions, and what impact they have on their day-to-day life, if any.
No, I think that is something, it's a really fundamental question. It's a really good question, and one which I sort of had to gloss over, but I do have an answer to that. When you look at certain elements of the Charter, particularly the religious, there isn't an overall idea that you will have identical religious festivals. The magistrates, presumably in coming up with their festivals, are coming up with something that is appropriate for their community, which will have certain things which look to Rome, but certain things which look to their past. And that's why we see, for example, continuity of local deities, particularly in the Celtic world, Celtic provinces, we see this. And so within these requirements, there is these gaps, almost like grey areas, where you can create that local identity. So one of the things about these local civic communities is that there is an idea they will look both to Rome, but also to what there already was. And so we find examples, where was I? I was in Pamplona, Pamplona and the museum there, looking at a whole series of tombstones from the Roman period. They have bulls on them. Depictions of bulls on them, which you don't find in other places. So that's obviously something that is important to them. They have retained that element. So I think within this, there is very definitely the element of being able to retain your own elements of your own culture, where they don't clash with these kind of Roman ideals, and create something which is distinctive to that local community. And this is where a lot of the stuff about hybridity has come in, because you can see that going on. But I would say the problem with hybridity is that you say you've got Roman, you've got, I don't know, Vatican, therefore you've got Roman Vatican, or you've got Roman and you've got what's going on in Pamplona, and you're creating a hybrid. Whereas actually what I would argue, and I think some of the work that is being done in other periods and in other disciplines, on just what creativity is, cultural creativity, I think there's a lot of that going on that we haven't looked at, or that we've ignored, and we've just said, oh, well, it's hybrid. They're taking a bit of this and a bit of that. Whereas what I would say is that within what is required and these kind of shared elements of Romanness, there is also the space to either keep something local and work that in and create something that sets you apart from the next town, for example, or there's even the ability to take elements of them and create something completely new, which you see in Gaul. If you have a look at Greg Wolf's work on Jupiter columns, where you get this very distinctive form of column with Roman iconography on it. It's eventually, you see it being adopted to a limited extent in Rome, but this is something which has a very marked distribution around the Rhine provinces. And it's not hybrid. Well, it's not hybrid, but it's not Roman, but it is Roman, but it is. And so I think that's something that is really, could be a really exciting avenue, is thinking about creativity and what that gives us. And so there is the opportunity to maintain those local customs, but through this sort of creating something which responds to your local positioning. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Good.
I think I saw in Epigraphy, I don't know if Claudia remember, because it was in a thesis, Epigraphy that was about an assimilation of Indo-Gallicus to Jupiter or other
That's a very common
I
phenomenon.
think in Epigraphy in Portugal.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, no, these are a particular kind of column, and they have depictions of the seasons at the base, and then various gods and that kind of thing, and then what looks like a Jupiter on the top. So it's the decoration more than the thing, but yeah. So.
Thank you. Let me tell that we are now able to receive questions from our viewers in the YouTube, please. So if you have questions, do not hesitate. Meanwhile, I have a question for you.
Okay.
I would like to know how do you reconcile this variety of experiences with the big narrative that comes from the Roman, the Latin literature, the Roman literature, which is basically about identity, which is basically, in my view at least, an essentialist narrative.
Yes.
The Roman being the the big superpower that is going to bring the civilization to all the people.
When you say the works, the writers, do you mean the ancient works and the ancient writers talking about sort of the Ciceros and those kinds of people? Yeah. I think it comes back down to this kind of power relationship within this, that at the same time you have the provincials creating an idea about what it is to be within it. A lot of our literary authors are trying to work out what it is to be an imperialist. And certainly it's something Tacitus really struggles with, this idea of an empire, being in charge of an empire, you're bringing slavery and all that kind of, and so I think it's that kind in a way, some of this is, it's a discussion, it's a debate that's going on at a different level almost, but obviously it has an impact because these are the people who are, that even if not the direct people, they are being read by the people who are framing these laws. And so I think how you reconcile them in a way is that there is an imbalance. And it goes back to something within the idea of what people are doing and agency, which gets talked about a lot, which is that people can impact, but not necessarily within a framework of their own choosing. So as people are sort of being citizens, they don't get to choose their framework. Their framework is imposed by Rome. And so I think all the time you've got this almost like dual view on a perspective. You've got one which is about imperial imposition, but then you've got the other of, well, you've got people just having to live within this, the kind of top down and the bottom up approach. And at some point, the people who are living in these communities are having to reconcile themselves with this. Just as, I don't know, Tacitus is having to reconcile himself with the fact that he's living in a community where he's very uneasy about imposing what he no longer thinks of as civilization on these people.
Thank you. Thank you. Very interesting. So, I think we have no more questions. So,
I can
Sergio.
Is there you talked about the Celtic subtract, and I wonder if, for instance, when we study the toponymy of the Iberian Peninsula, there are many elements of the Celtic culture and Celtic language. And I wonder if that the Romans adopted this kind of toponymy and applied it to other places, because, for example, the instance, the element Kant stone, it's related to Kent, and is related to a city nearby, Coimbra, Cantanhede. And the question is that if the Roman language took these elements and applied to other places. So
one of the interesting things that's come out of the work that the most recent epigraphic discoveries in Britain, which are the Vindolanda tablets, and there's a set of tablets from Rome. So Britain is appalling for inscriptions on stone, but it's amazing for inscriptions on wood, but letters and administrative documents. And one of the things that's been worked on for that by a Celtic language specialist is how specific Celtic words are being adopted into the Latin. And I think she claims there's just within this body of documents, she's been able to find over 100 actual Celtic words that then get adopted. Now, this is in Britain by the Roman army are then adopting them. But yes, I think in terms of place names, very often place names, I think throughout the West, retain that local element. Most of the British towns, for example, and I think a lot of the Gallic towns retain their Celtic, what we assume pre-Roman Celtic names, as part of their names. So somewhere like Verulamium, the Celtic Verlamion, we find on coinage. So yes, I think they're keeping them. And I think there's less of an imposition. There's an imposition in terms of yes, you will have our form of settlement, but you can keep your local toponyms. And then these carry on and become adopted into the names of the towns. You still find them in people's names as well, to a certain extent.
I remember that Brenda Bell, in a study on the contribution of Caesar, Bellum Gallicum, to ethnography, she says that there are Celtic towns in the Bellum Gallicum, but few only, Ambacti, Solduri, and Druides, Essedum, and one or two more.
Yeah, we find it markedly in Gaul when you see the formation of the urban network particularly under Augustus, and you get towns, Augusta Briga, Augusta Dunum, that kind of thing. The number which have the Celtic on the end, and then the name of Augustus or Caesar at the front.
Augusto Dunum is an element that is Neerlandish. How we say
Netherlands.
Netherlands. Dunum. But they think that maybe taken from the Netherlands, but from the Celtic language. We have in Portugal is Duna. Duna in the Duna in Portuguese.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of bilingualism working together. I think there's some really interesting work being done on how bilingualism works. And probably the idea that most of the people in the empire are going to be bilingual, trilingual, or whatever, and have different languages, and bring the two together. There's sort of elements you can do, identify elements of kind of creation of, we call it Pidgin, but not quite, it's almost like Creole languages out of different ones, and how you bring in different elements of the languages together. So it's one of those things where we see the kind of local being retained within the Roman. And I think naming is quite an important part of that. Okay. So, do you want to
From BioRom.
say something?
Only to finish. Okay. On behalf of the BioRom project, I would like to thank Professor Luis Revel for coming to us and for this interesting conference she gave us. And I would like to thank the students as well, PhD students, master students, and other students. Thank you for coming, and thank as well the people abroad. Thank you for the very interesting question. Thank you. Classes continue.